Richard Whittaker's new book is At the Grace Cafe. Richard earned his MA from Columbia University and won 2 Hopwood First Prizes for poetry at the University of Michigan. He has taught writing workshops at the Port Townsend Writers Conference and the Upward Bound program at Western Washington University, and later worked as a case manager with the mentally ill. Gayle Kaune from Port Townsend is the author of 3 books, Still Life in the Physical World, All the Birds Awake, and Noise from the Stars. She writes poems blessed by the ordinary. Kaune has published widely in magazines and has won several Washington Poets Awards and a Ben-Hur Lampman Award. A licensed clinical social worker, she has taught workshops throughout the Northwest, including at the Port Townsend Writers Conference. Susan Landgraf was awarded an Academy of American Poets Laureate Award in 2020. Books including The Inspired Poet, a writing exercise book, and What We Bury Changes the Ground, and Other Voices. She served as a Poet Laureate of Auburn, Washington from 2018 to 2020. And finally, last but not least, Thomas Mitchell's newest book, When We Arrive, which I do not have because we are out of stock right now, but you can order it from Village Books, has just been published by Lost Horse Press. And he is the author of 2 previous books of poetry, The Way Summer Ends and Caribou. His poems have appeared in many journals and most recently has been selected as the featured American poet in the High Window. Please welcome our readers tonight, and I hope you enjoy, everyone.
What'd you do? Do you want gallery view?
Thanks to Charlie. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
We can hear you just fine.
Thanks. And thanks everybody for coming. I want to welcome you here. I'll start with poems from my new book at the Grace Cafe. First one is called Two Truths, One Lie. And the speaker is a counselor on 4 South. In Times Square, I gave this young kiddo $17, almost all my cash. He said he needed cab fare so he could get an operation in New Jersey on his testicles. Near Honolulu, I soared on the back of a dolphin over blue-green water, the sharp hill of Cocoa Head, the round haunch of Hanoma. Sometimes when I work on this unit, the charge nurse has me sing to calm things down. Tonight I sang Here Comes the Sun for Carlos in 4-point restraints. My sister walks 6 miles barefoot to her bank. Chloe doesn't take meds, can't be detained, no danger to self or others. I haven't sung for her in 40 years. Now, since our father died, she thinks her phone's bugged. Chloe has a roof, enough food to eat, we think. She looks and smells like a street person. If anyone asks for $17 cab fare so he can get an operation on his balls, I'd say, here's $3 for the train. Is love stronger than death? Tell me the truth. Tell me a lie. This next poem is called This Dream I Don't Tell My Sister. Random windows, some lamplit. As in a Hollywood movie, our mother stands up from her wheelchair. How she holds her arms out as if flying. Please slow down, I ask. I won't, she says. Now she pounds on oak doors, beats on leaded glass. By the last brick house, our house, a low sun, ochre and smoke. Our mother, mild as a still life, how she shouts, got to get Chloe in the hospital. A rictus of mist under streetlights. Our mother straightens clouds like coverlets, treads past the sun. That prompt random windows was by the famous poet Gayle Kaune, who will follow me. Next poem is called Listening to a House. In the months after our mother's death, her presence stayed close. Once something told me to stop walking and listen to a certain derelict house I had thought empty. Late afternoon shadows, sunspots and yellow leaves. A run of gold notes from a saxophone burst from an upstairs window. The riff took off, flying from one rasp low in the sax man's throat to nearly an octave above. It stopped, started again. Although I couldn't see her, I wanted to say something to our mother in her wheelchair of air, her hands narrow as leaves. In this black window, flecks of mica, one gold horn. Next poem is in memory of the men and women murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. It's called Staring West Out a Rear Window of the Keystone Ferry. As we pull away from creosoted pilings, there's this cleft in the dark part of twilight, a wash of pale blue in the west. I scan well-lit faces in this cabin, picture Linda safe at home. As we start to cross the channel, the ferry veers. I brace both hands against the hull. No stars, no dock, just the glossy charcoal of this water. The next poem is from a sequence of poems called In Wartime. There on the screen, that's him, the enemy. His warehouse filled with, is it chemicals? The announcer doesn't say. We see the crosshairs zoom in on a gate, the outline of a door. It's open. From the left, wheels, a truck, a man runs up. Uh-oh, guess he shouldn't have, the announcer says. In hell, we shouldn't laugh. Fixed in the lines of missile sites, the door goes up in flames. Just like a video game, you say. We watch the replay, see the close-up, take in the same scene over and over. Numbly, we touch each other, draw apart. Death from afar is death, and I forget what it's all for. Next one's from another one of my books. This poem is called Pear Trees on Irving Street. They float, these white trees. A few petals fall into the street, not stars fading, not snow. The trees have blossomed in a freezing east wind. None, I think, has any regrets or choice. If the night frost comes too thick, too fast, they'll give what they have to, as if it were nothing. These clusters, held not by black branches, but their own buoyancy. And the next poem is called Discreet. When I was sick of the guile of windows, the weariness of doors, the promises I couldn't keep, you offered me a mantle and a hearth, real work to do. Doors became doors. Some windows don't have to be looked into. Like peony buds knit up, you held me with your promises, different from streets begging to be streets. Your strength, like lacework, your laughter, the surface of a lake. When fire dismantled me, you were discreet. And a few poems from my first book. There's a longer one called Sleeping Beauty Roses. Late August, the elm trees arched in the heat, leaves fat as dinner plates. I thought there would be more time. I could read or while away the hours on a poem, revise it over and over till it was right. Back then it was never right. The tone, a sound, and to get away from the heat, I'd go down to the basement, a vise on a tool bench clamped on nothing. A Michigan license plate from when? A piano that wasn't ours, in a long dance room with a wooden floor. It was time to come to dinner. Soon it would be time to ask him questions, since he was always right. And then there would be hours of TV, misturns and westeries, we called them. The heat of his coffee cup I brought him, Mom handing us plates of pie, the smell of cinnamon. I could revise all this forever, add some violence, some sex, revise our lives into 77 Sunset Strip. There'd be time for walks to Livernois and heaping plates of stories like trips to Tomorrowland. He was right. You always knew who the killer was. If you couldn't stand the heat, you got out of. But she didn't. She was ours. We were hers. Why didn't she leave? Hours of cooking, cleaning. Where did it go, she asked. Grandma advised her to leave, offered to take care of us kids. But the heat of their love-hate had pulled them out of time, made them a fact like death or Texas. She couldn't get it right. I should have. But there were plates to wash, and tomorrow's goodbye on fine blue plates from Italy. She'd gather up the hours like sleeping beauty roses, make them come out, if not right, well, almost. So I might write some lines revised by grief's oblique dark leaves. Recall the times she took us swimming at Kensington, huge trees in the heat by a street light, summer's fragile dinner plates, the heat unbroken. There's time. What's 24 hours times 60 minutes, 60 heartbeats? It's all right. Don't revise. And a shorter one, Night Fields. She was riding the rope swing under the fir tree, and somewhere a branch was creaking. She gazed at the tree with its gray bark, up where the branches started 30 feet high. A rushing went through them. They'd been quiet at her window, but now they were too loud, too close, like the sea. The goats, staked out, munched on their weeds, and she leaned into the dark, closing her eyes as if she knew trees can grow tired of being trees, knew they can toss and heave and take her through the dark fields. And one more, possibly if there's time, I'll do one more after that or save it till the end. This is called Sabbath of Complete Rest. I've been thinking what that might mean. So I listened to the wind in the fir trees outside our red house. How the trees stand almost like horses asleep on their feet. How their roots touch crevices and soil. How at night their branches, blacker than the sky, must not forget yellow forsythias, summer, their own dark needles. How they wait, how they've waited. This is no psalm of light, Chloe, no song of white horses in the sun. The root of the word shalom means complete. And I'll make this next one my last one. Disappearances. Birds were moving over the water. A thin dark cloud, maybe a mile long, slowly flattening. And through the binoculars, we saw dunlins flung like leaves, so many flickering and vying. All at once, the cloud flipped over, white, black, white, in the sunlight fading to nothing. They came slanting up, a sleeve pulled inside out, unraveling. Special effects, you said, though the birds didn't seem to know they were doing anything special. flashing in and out of this life and some second life over gray water. And on to my good friend and famous poet, Gayle Kaune.
Thanks, Richard. That was wonderful. Those of you, I sent a mea culpa. I sent a mailing out yesterday to people on my email, some of them, and with the announcement. And it's very embarrassing to me, but I do think those of you who aren't poets might. Trailing the email was a bunch of correspondence between Richard and I, where he sends me a poem and I'm like, boom, that's all I have time to say. So it was funny to me, but I apologize, Richard. Today,
No problem.
first I want to thank Village Books, and this is the book that came out last, Noise from Stars, and you can order it from there. But today I'm going to read all poems that aren't in books because I'm going to just read poems that I've written during the pandemic. Because I figure I'm probably never going to read them again or put them in a book or whatever. And that's what we've all been through this last year. So the first poem I want to read after I thank DeChali and Claire from Village Books, and all these, Tom and Susan and Richard, were all part of the Madrona Writers. There's about a dozen of us, and we meet twice a year and we write like crazy. We get a residency at Centrum. And I want to thank them. And then I want to thank Michael Hanner. I'm in a little Sunday morning group that he sends out prompts, and all the poems I've written this year were just started by those prompts. So otherwise I wouldn't have written, because it just was kind of a depressing year, but maybe not for you. Anyhow, the first poem was an ekphrastic write-in that had started years ago at Northwind. We all went down to the gallery one night, looked at all the paintings they had, and then we wrote right there in the gallery. And then 2 weeks later, we came back in the gallery and we read the poems. But because of COVID, they were, everyone's been so creative, so adaptable, and they somehow got the pictures, the paintings online, and then we wrote to one or two of them, and then we sent them in, and they chose some to do a video of, and this was one. I don't have the painting to show you, but you'll just have to imagine it. Morning in Lucca, Nobody Shall Sleep, after a painting by Jean Edwards, Morning in Lucca. In the painting, a middle-aged woman dressed in red trench coat walks the busy promenade. That might have been me 20 years ago, the summer we visited Lucca. One morning, I woke early, strolled the streets of the village looking for a cappuccino. True, I wouldn't have worn a skirt like this woman, and never a purse that folded like an envelope. But I had red hair then, and I loved to walk. The day before, we visited Puccini's birthplace, listened to a recording of Nessun Dorma. We were 4, 2 couples staying in a pensione called the Bird's Nest. Of course, none of us could sleep. Every afternoon we explored together, but the early light was mine, just as it had been this artist's, or the woman in the red coat as she walked down the street. One morning, I went to a church, and in their shop that filled with rosaries, I bought a poster of a fresco, Madonna and Child. But there was someone else in the portrait. She was rinsing white towels in a basin. A midwife. I was happy about that. Who wants to birth a child without the help of another woman? Later that day, The four of us walked the wall surrounding the city. Built in the Middle Ages, the ancient edifice had joggers and bikers circling on the path on top. I know it's wrong, but I took a piece of its crumbled mortar. I learned that theft from my mother. She midwifed me into petty crime, stealing plastic headsets from planes, or worse, small fossils from the petrified forests. Scarcity and keepsakes, her two excuses. But for now, I bless this artist who gives me this scene, a souvenir of that moment in Lucca. A woman alone in a red trench coat, bathed in morning light. Actually, I forgot I can't split the screen, but in the back, I wanted to tell you this before. You'll see the poster. I don't know how big this shows up, but there is, let's put on speaker. Oh, it doesn't show me. But anyhow, there's the midwife and Madonna and baby. So I used to teach junior high, so I'm really big on audiovisual techniques. Okay, now the next were written in the Sunday morning prompt thing, and of course revised later. When did this begin? Lung disease in the time of COVID. When did this begin? Homesickness for desert, cactus, candelabra, and an obsession with a Netflix series, soap opera really, that got me through evenings of the election. When did this start? Canceled trips to the market, rice noodles from scratch, recocking the bathtub, recocking the ego, filling in the cracks of the cobblestones of my heart. It was a time of quarantine goals, to manage a day without getting sick, catching the bug, standing upwind of the virus whenever you pass someone outside. When did this begin? The focus on numbers, of deaths, of hospital beds, of vaccination dreams. How long does this reality last? This aspirations turning to inspirations, always the oxygen meter, measuring concentrations, always the flashing red light, above 88, below 88, panic and pandemic. Which breath will be your last? I'm looking for a poem. Well, I don't know, it may be in here, it may not. We'll just keep going. After, and then we had the Black Lives Matter protests. After Black Lives Matter protests, when my father homesteaded in Alaska before World War II, he didn't know about redlining. He didn't know that the real estate agent who drew up all the contracts, this is now years later, after he had proved up on the land and it was his, after he decided to sell it lot by lot and the agent wrote the documents as to who could buy the land, those covenants forbade people of color. Oh yes, flowers of color, brilliant summers of fireweed, wild sumac, any vision to get through the long winters, but not a whisper of segregation in the air, not a bare track of scandal. That's the way it was done. Everyone had their own neighborhood, their own school. That was the rotatable goal, to keep the money neat, tidy, property values up, to keep the money recirculating during the cold winters, to keep the money in icy white hands. Now I want to read Slip and Fall. Take a breath of water. I haven't quite mastered the split screen so I'm playing with my papers. Slip and fall. The orthopod, when I fractured my ankle, the orthopod I saw who told bad jokes, was one of the doctors for the Green Bay Packers. I couldn't help but ask if he flies back and forth, Washington to Wisconsin. Of course he does, I told myself, but undeterred by embarrassment or guilt because of my fractured ankle, I requested a medical excuse from training practice. This was a tired joke for a retired crippled woman to make, I'm sure, an envelope already stamped and on its way. My wishful thinking that life was normal, no raging virus, no quarantines, protests, police brutality, my ankle flexible, unbroken, his Green Bay Packers still running toward their goals. And then I have two more. This one is untitled. The older woman showed up for dinner with a smart brown purse, so small for a woman mid-80s, as if she had transported herself back to an earlier life, when all one carried was lipstick and comb, and no one had particular needs that filled a purse with pills, keys, collapsible cups, and tissues, always tissues, as her body began to shed its water like a mechanic draining a carburetor. Really, her body had become a kind of swamp with roots like willow, tupelo, cypress tangled up inside. Once they did a surgery on her heart, but there were so many veins leading in and out that they sewed a little machine inside and told her to carry a remote device in her purse forever. Something to jumpstart her life. Something that she managed to cram in the little brown leather pocketbook she carried out to dinner. Something she had come to know as God. And then my last poem is titled F star CK. Y'all know what that is. F star CK 2020. I'm going to say it. I survived. Yes, I rode that wild COVID Mustang of 2020 and I didn't die. Yes, I drank Manhattans and listened to my dishwasher thump, thump every night rather than let a repairman enter my house. Oh, yes, and yes, I ignored certain medical conditions rather than make appointments for the dentist, gynecologist, eye doctor. I won't mention pus. I tried to escape in my Prius, but that would seem too obvious. Everyone would know by my now white hair, no visits to the beauty shop, and my white skin, that I was of an age and I was privileged to get the vaccine first. Really, best to lay low and stay home. Yes, F star this past year, but let's praise the kids that Zoom schooled and the parents who taught them, work their own jobs at the same time. Yes, F star it all, but didn't we learn how to live with the basics, not needing diversions, excursions, and those essential workers, the grocery clerks, bus drivers, nurses, and EMTs, how much they risked, how much they gave, and how they let us dream of a COVID-free future. Yes, F star 2020, but didn't we learn to love more deeply what it meant? So thank you. And now on to Tom Mitchell, right, who has a new book out, and I'm excited to read it.
now that I'm unmuted. Thank you. And thank you, Village Books, Claire and Richard. Thank you for the invite. This is terrific. I'm so happy to be here. Maybe not live, but vicariously anyway. I'm going to begin with a poem that's my response to, pretty much my response to what has happened to children at our southern border. And I find that very disturbing. And this was a poem that I felt almost had to be written. It just came to me. And it starts off with an epigraph from James Baldwin. It is a terrible and inexorable law that one cannot deny the humanity of another without diminishing one's own. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself. Little birds. The same stars as yesterday are still unraveling, blinking their platinum and copper signals through the milieu of time. As the shadow from the chain-link fence gathers around them, the children are restless under their silver blankets. A few still awake sob in muted tones. Jose Alejandro Escobar raises the metal cup to Consuela's lips and remembers the Rio Grande, startling water cascading over rocks, his father's words disappearing, then returning in a bubbly ebb. Calance chavos que viene la migra. Hurry up, guys. Patrol is about. It was because of his dawdling that they came. The Border Patrol in their astonishing black uniforms. If it weren't for those damnable starlings and their incessant chatter, their dappled wings sparkling in the sunlight, he knew he could capture them in the pages of his sketchbook. The starlings were scruffed and tawny as they shook their heads at river's edge. So different from the birds back home in Guatemala. The brilliant quetzal robed in turquoise. The keel-billed toucans dipping in the Las Serenas fountain in Antigua. The pink-headed warblers darting in and out of brilliant bougainvillea. In the same plaza where even now the cartel and roving gangs spray their unmistakable taggings of red and black. At the border crossing in Juarez, they were told there was no more room. His mother lowered her eyes, and his father admonished Jose, never let go of your sister's tiny hand. Now, as early light begins to illuminate the cage, he holds Consuela in his arms, closes his eyes, and again they follow the migrant trail that snakes across the desert. He wears a bandana tucked under his ball cap to protect his face and neck from the scorching sun. His flimsy sneakers are no match for thorny cholla pods that easily pierce foam rubber soles, while ahead he could see a clump of Palo Verde trees, providing some rare shade and the comforting sound of his mother's voice. I live in the Coos Bay North Bend area, so I live less than a mile away from the ocean. So water has a way of creeping into my life and my poems. I've always lived near the sea. I was in the Navy for 4 years. I'm originally from Long Island, New York. And so this one was kind of a natural vision back to, well, it's called Kayaking, Long Island Sound. I'm strolling along the beach this cold, bleak morning. Pale seagrass bending in the wind. When there up ahead in the lustrous surf, I see a kayaker, sleek as a seal, cutting through the waves, lifting his paddle to the broken sunlight. I'm approaching 73, agile as an easy chair. But this is where my longing starts, the yearning for another life, the one where I'm lean and muscular, where I shoulder my kayak, stride into waves, and one fluid movement, lift myself into the seat, then over the breakers. I'm waiting for the vessel to right when I'm pulled through a series of surging rifts, water brimming across an invisible bow, the kayak moving on its own accord, then settling into a more even flow. I dip the paddle, counterbalancing my weight, leaning into the sea's wake, now one with the kayak, wind at my back, paddling through a spitting drizzle in an endless straight line as I push through emerald top. Gets good. The sun comes out and turns the sea a radiant blue. 3 pelicans rattle by on their way to somewhere. China Bowl. Along the trail, foxglove in rows, like candelabra, pink here, at the end of a stand of Douglas fir. The sky expands westward, carrying veils of cirrus clouds toward China, where perhaps a fishmonger is filleting a red snapper to sell at market. Every once in a while, pausing to wipe the blood from his right hand, then surgically removing the spine in one masterful stroke. His daughter is balancing a pinwheel in one hand, an ornate porcelain bowl in the other. Colorful red and yellow streamers shift to the wind. He has a 9-hour advantage over me. I'm just beginning to adjust my eyes to the early sunlight, peeking over the hillside as a snail crosses my path, dragging its grotesqueness, gray and filmy, along with its amber shell, leaving a silver trail. I can't see around the bend, but the sound of crows catches my attention. There are so many things that happen in this world, ones that I can remember and others I can't forget. Across the Pacific, the fishmonger is assembling a delicate row of snails, admiring their uniform beauty, the sheen of evening light pouring over their shells, then awakens to the little girl's astonishment as the porcelain bowl shatters. I have a brother, one brother. He's my younger brother, and he's free-spirited, and he loves to wander like a vagabond. And so this poem, I dedicated this poem to him, and it's called He Wakes Up Every Morning to the Bray of Wild Burros. And the epigraph goes like this: the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice. Isaiah 35. My brother writes from his hammock in the desert. It says the evening blush has gone from red to magenta. Says Yuma's tough terrain is now soft with color, the smell of sage. Sparrows follow one another across the sky. He says this is a place where clouds are easily confused with mountains, where the occasional raptor reminds him of his proper size. He's not afraid of rattlesnakes or being alone. There's a simple satisfaction in the glow of a cigarette, the last light of the stars sputtering like a dying campfire, watching the Chihuahuan moon drift gently away from Jupiter. It's time to dim the lights on his camper. The night wind lulls him to sleep while wild burros scuttle in the underbrush. And he dreams the incomprehensible dream of another day, knowing there's so much to live for, so much one can live without. I have a sort of, this is sort of an ekphrastic poem that happens at the very beginning of this book. And, but it also involves the artist. And so it's called The Impressionist's Dream. In the morning, he's still grasping the feathery pillow, shifting his weight across the sofa cushions, while a small boy casts his line over the riffles on the Seine, unaware of a series of brownish green shades moving both silently beneath the surface. A woman in a fresh pink gown holds a parasol adrift in the wind. A figural tree with an almost human torso leans on the east bank, opening to a garden with the most splendid bushes, hollyberries, indelibly red, blazing splotches against a strikingly blue sky. The light itself seems to granulate as it falls on the water, shimmering with an incandescence of gunmetal gray. Luminous blues, spatterings of opaque white. He feels the urge to rub out the beginnings of a long cloud bank, then starts to mix a complex of gouts, smears, gobs, dabs, and dribbles that eventually blend into the form of a small skiff drifting aimlessly past a gallery of bystanders. The boy is now wearing a hat smudged to one side, and the woman begins to throw an ochre and olive shadow elegantly beside the base of the tree. Three wayward turns suddenly appear in the upper left-hand corner. There's a last-minute decision to paint long strokes of black to outline the figures as he changes his position, and the living room curtains begin to brighten. And this will be the last poem. It's called Sanctuary. And it's for Christine. If I had never listened to the Council of Water, heard the icy river, crossed the snowy field against the wind's wake, followed a bobcat's trail into an unsettling whiteness, considered the number of unlit windows sparkling in afternoon sunlight, the lazy farms now just a rambling thought, empty silos full of ghosts, the tap of tree branches, thin veneer of cold clinging to the uppermost tips. I'd wrap myself in mounds of wool, a strident scarf as blue as the sky, then break toward the distant hills beyond the call of the villages where no one could find me, and wait for the vigil of the trumpeter swans, moving from one silence to another, the starlings rising in the fields, a red-tailed hawk drifting in absolute loneliness. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Susan Landgraf.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really honored to be reading with all of you. And I especially want to thank Richard for setting this up. Also for Claire McElroy-Chesson and Degali for being here. And it's just great to read with you, Richard, with you, Gayle, and with you, Tom. I chose poems tonight that have some connection to food and drink. The first three will be from the book, What We Bury Changes the Ground. Potato eyes. We push without legs like cocoons, the color of maggots, invigilating our way past pill bugs, worms, antennae reaching for the feel of rain, not just wetness, but for the music of it. By now, our eyes opened, unfurling. We lie like a memory, waiting for the spade. We keep our nightshade family to ourselves. Pockets growing among the soil and millipedes, stones singing their own stories of kingdoms and uprisings. The potato eaters, miners, and stonemasons, all of them knowing by the sweat of their brows. My mother's parents played a huge role in my life. They were immigrants from Hungary, came across separately, but they gave me a safe place in the midst of a tumultuous, violent childhood. Their staples were potatoes, pasta, fruits, and vegetables in season, canned fruits and vegetables out of the root cellar during the winter. We had meat on Sundays. I'll save the poem about my refusal to eat cow tongue for another reading. This poem is called Sunday Dinner, and it's about pigs. Sunday dinner. I didn't think of pigs wallowing in mud, feces of the pen, pigs' guts filled with cabbages and slop. I didn't think of squeals, then barnyard silence, a dozen feet wrapped in white paper at the butcher's and double knotted with string. Grandma's stubby fingers worrying the package open on the Formica table. The kitchen burbled with pots of boiling things. In white soup bowls, jelly cooled for a light amber around the feet, waiting for Sunday's crocheted tablecloth, creamy webs holding her china and silver. My grandparents' guttural voices mixed with pinging forks and knives, and our slurping as we sucked jelly out of the feet. More, my grandfather urged us eat. Verse today, and my sisters and I chorused, "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again to rend you." I didn't think of the pigs. And the last one from the book, Between Worlds, and it begins with an epigraph. When the forest dies, its children die. Frog song, crickets, and dragonflies darning the air. 350 million years laying their eggs in the pond stalks or mating mid-flight, their primitive wings deftly beating, their basket-like legs scooping prey. This is the garden of nettles and horsetails, of toadstools and bulging roots, of quicksand and leeches. And there are the nymphs out of the water into the air. 350 million years of transformation on the 21st day before their death. Shimmering dragons whirring the lances of light. The forest quickening today, and its people gathering peach palm fruit, mushrooms, fern fronds. And then the following are recent poems. After a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, we lose weeks, oaths. Despair turns down an icy road to Hawaii. We win the keys to Casablanca. We see Hawaii and beautiful bodies, luminous grape-colored possibilities. We discover, yes, we discover nothing is forbidden until the next morning. The past months have been a time of loss, Gayle, as you so beautifully rendered in your reading tonight. And this poem was written last spring, a year ago, before my sister died on January 15th of this year. It's called One Day of Juxtapositions. My sister is in the hospital in Florida, my stepbrother in New York. I sweep my deck, cut back dead marjoram sprigs, and clip bent beanstalks. My throat's thoughts overgrown with worry. Jack comes to mind. He and his mother mired in poverty. Foolish Jack, trading his cow for a handful of beans. What an act, believing in magic, then finding a castle and a goose that lays golden eggs. I look down at my overgrown garden, the rose bush more thorns than buds, the slugs looking for a meal, the fence leaning downhill, the backyard itself sliding. The geoengineer says I'll need a wall, as if it's as simple as crossing a time zone. I concentrate on the potted plants, which I have some control over. There in the blue pot, the red-headed geranium I just planted, luminous in the gray afternoon, the dill and chives pushing up, and my fingernails caked with dirt, my hands working together. I smell the weather changing to rain as I watch a Steller's jay, its blue wings like a streak through the trees. Then remember my sister and stepbrother hooked up to tubes and monitors. And the best I can do is take the bag full of leaves to the garbage can and wash my hands. This next poem is called Making Pesto. The last time I made pesto, my son had jumped out of a 100-foot fir tree. First, the scream, then the ground shaking. Today, my oldest daughter says she remembers that day, me crying on the phone, the medics following my husband's shouts to our son's moans. She remembers the smells in the day after as I chopped, churned, read May Sarton, cried, and prayed. She wasn't there to hear me cry myself to sleep while she was missing. Now we have this assembly line. She peels the garlic, rinses the basil, pats it dry. While I churned garlic, basil, pine nuts, then Parmesan cheese, fresh squeezed lemon juice, ground pepper, and olive oil into a foaming green sea. She fills the jars and talks about how surprised she is to still be married to the husband who left her twice. Our talk fills the years we missed. 17 jars of gold, she says. Yes, gold. And my son coming to join us for dinner. And my last poem is called Gary Copeland Lilly's Recipe. My good friend, Gary Copeland Lilly, who also Tom had his last book published by Lost Horse. And again, it's titled Gary Copeland Lilly's Recipe. Keeping wickedness from your door is magic you can count on. A haint blue bottle tree. Fill the bottles with the blessed earth, stones, bones, old letters and prayers. Against the curses of certain ancestors and practitioners of blame and shame, an invitation for ancestors that have your back. If you don't have an oak or pine, build a facsimile. Pour a shot of good whiskey and baptize the ground under your tree. Pour a second shot and bless yourself. Thank you for joining us. I hope there are questions, and thank you, Village Books, again for having us. And now I hope there are some questions.
There are
Ollie,
some
thank you.
questions. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Thomas and Gayle and Richard, also for your readings. Those are some wonderful poems we got to hear. There are some questions for, there's 3 questions for all 4 of you. Let me just pull it back up here. Yes. So these questions are for all 4 of you guys. What was the first time you read poetry aloud? When were you first published? And who is your most important audience?
You're probably first.
Well, I'll go.
Okay.
First time I read was at the Carco Theater in Renton with Lonnie Kaneko and James Maseo Mitsui. And that was some 3 years after I took Lonnie's class, where I was required to write a poem, 2 poems, I think it was. And I said, I don't write poetry, I hate poetry. So something changed, obviously, in that time period. The first poem, I can't remember when it was published, but it was in a journal called Hyacinths and Biscuits. It's the first poems I sent out. And I guess I had to learn over a long period of time that it isn't always that quick that you get something published. And lastly, who's my most important audience? People who have endured and find meaning in whatever it is that they do. And often that's poetry. Thank you for the questions.
Good questions. I'll go next if that's okay. First time I read poetry aloud, I can't remember that, but I remember the first time I had to read something aloud in a class in high school. I had to read a book report aloud, and people told me that afterward my hands were shaking, is what I remember about it. I was 16 years old. Not exactly a good, what do you call it, forerunner of somebody who decided to be a teacher for many years. Let's see, first got published. I had some very early success. I got spoiled. I had 2 poems published in a magazine called Generation at University of Michigan. And then I don't think I got anything published for about 10 years after that. And the last question, my most important audience, that is a harder one to say. When I write a poem, well, it depends.
Go ahead.
Often I write from a prompt in our groups or on my own, and I write very fast. And as if I were the only audience. It permits you to, what Bill Stafford called lower your standards. You pretty much accept whatever comes without editing it, free writes. And then as I revise, I write as if my dreams from when I was 18 or 19 years old and I thought I could be as good as Dylan Thomas, maybe not quite as good as Shakespeare, but maybe Dylan Thomas and maybe in my wildest dreams, Keats, as if they might want to hear me. And I go over and over the damn things forever. One of my poems, that one I read you, Sleeping Beauty Roses, I remember writing it very fast, and it was a sestina, which for those of you poets know it can be like a medieval torture device, but really what it is, you have to repeat these 6 words in a certain pattern 6 times and then throw them in at the end as if it's all offhand. And your main goal is to try and fool everybody that isn't really a sestina. Or you write sonnets where you have to fool people that it isn't a sonnet, because that's what the age demands, so to speak. But my most important audience, oddly enough, almost my muse sometimes, I've written so many poems for my mentally ill sister, and that's who I often write to. Though often my first audience is my partner, Linda, and Patty Hooper out there. Hello, she's often been my critiquer, and Gayle Kaune, as she mentioned, are very important readers to me. Thanks for the questions.
Gayle or Thomas, would one of you like to go next?
Well, Gayle, it looks like she's still muted, so I guess I'll go.
Sure. Do you need me to repeat the questions at all?
No, I think I've got it.
Okay.
But thank you. Okay, as far as the first time I read out loud, poetry out loud, it was back in the late 60s, early 70s, at a coffee house in Sacramento. I cannot remember the name of the coffee house. It doesn't exist anymore, except in my mind. And but I do remember I read with Gary Thompson, who I was going to school with at that time, and Jim Young and Martha Evans, and they're all still writing poetry, which is a mind blower after that long. The first poem I had published was called Hound of Heaven. Ever heard of a poem entitled Hound of Heaven? Well, I took the title and I wrote my own Hound of Heaven. And the New Orleans Review published it. And I was at the University of Montana working with Dick Hugo at that time and Madeline DeFries. And I was as shocked as anybody else. And like Richard, my most important audience, my wife is my #1 editor. I read to her and she has an ear. And not just for poetry, I might add. I get a lot of feedback. She's wonderful, and I also exchange quite a bit with a good friend and poet, Albert Garcia, and Don Schofield, who's in Greece. And so, there are different audiences for different purposes. But as far as my own personal needs, those are the people who I value the most. There you go.
Well, I'll answer this. My first published poem I self-published, and I was probably about 7, and it was called The Big Poem, Story, and Joke Book, POAM, and it was between 2 blue construction sheets of paper. And I have it somewhere. I hope to find it. Nice. And then the next poem I published was when I was 9, because we moved to Las Vegas when I was 9, and it was on the poetry page of the Las Vegas Review Journal. But I just put my initials, GER. It was an adult poetry page, because I was very embarrassed to be so emotional and vulnerable for my parents to see. And it mentioned God, and God was like, you just didn't mention God in my family, at least, and it was like God's wish that my dog die. Some, kind of schmaltzy, but usually poetry pages in small newspapers are schmaltzy. But it didn't put my age. And then the first, I guess you would say, real publication after, this is kind of funny too, after I had been writing, was I'd send some things out and they'd come back, and they always say, write a cover letter, don't write a cover letter. So I sent a poem to Snapdragon, which was edited by Ron McFarlane, and it said, "Dear editor," this was the poem, "here is my latest batch of cookies for consideration. All have been well received at regional cookie workshops, and it was a play on that. And he published it. So that was my first real publication. First time I read out loud, I really can't remember, but when I started writing seriously, I was 32. I had a new baby, and I was part of this Mid-Columbia writers group. And there was actually a couple of they're still writing. They were really good poets or became good poets, some of them. But we were the person, Faith Beamer Cook, I don't know, she was always organizing these readings. So at the first reading I really remember was at a state fair, it was the Benton County Fair. And it wasn't like we had a stage and an audience. We had a little booth, next to the canned goods or the whatever. And then people's, where they were selling air conditioners, and people walked by. And you stood there and you tried to get their attention. Not a bad way to read, because you learn, kind of like my few years as a junior high teacher, attention span is not that great. So with your audience. So that was good training. That and the bars, when you read in a bar and I read in a coffee shop, not everyone's looking at you on a stage or screen, which is nice. And what audience? I don't know. I write a poem, and I try to make my poems accessible, but there's kind of two kinds of poems that I'll write. Some that are pretty accessible on listening to them, like today, and some that take a little more piecing out that would be in a book maybe. And my audience, boy, I just think it's anyone who will read it. But of course, there's certain audiences I don't ever get to, but I have been in a couple slams, and that was fun. That's a different audience, and that was really fun. But I see my friends are talking about readers. So of course, Richard's one of my first readers. I don't have too many. We used to workshop all our poems, a bunch of us, but now you got to just have a few trusted readers, because they sort of have to know what your style is. So Richard's one. And then Karen Seashore, she was here earlier. I think she had to go have company. I don't see her here anymore, but she's a fiction writer, but she's a wonderful reader too. So those are kind of my first readers. And Bill, my husband, hi, Bill. He'll say, I don't understand poetry. So I have to pick and choose. Okay, that was it for me.
All right, thank you guys for answering that question. I don't see any other ones. So would now I'll post in the chat.
I can't hear.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you guys for answering those questions. And right now I'll put the link in the chat here to the YouTube channel where you can view this event once it's uploaded, and past events also. And also, I'm sorry, it keeps muting me. Not sure why, but there in the chat is the link to the Village Books website where you can purchase today's books, and the YouTube channel. Thank you guys, Gayle, Thomas, Richard, and Susan. Thank you guys so much for joining us today and sharing your poetry with us.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience as well for joining us today. Do our poets have any last words?
There's a lot of readings going on right now, it seems, and I just want to thank everyone who came to this one.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you. We love our supportive audience. We always have a great showing, and thank you once more to our authors for agreeing to do this reading. hopefully we can do one in person in the near-ish future here. But thank you all so much, and I'd like to wish you all a good night.
Thank you, Golly, for doing the
Thank you,
hosting.
Charlie.
Thank you
Thank
guys.
you, Polly. I appreciate it very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye,
very
all
much.
of you I know. Thank
And
you.
Thank you.
All of you I don't know.
And those two, yes,
It was great fun.
it
Good.
was.
Bye.